Welcome back to the Place We Find Ourselves podcast. I'm Adam Young, and today I am going to talk about attachment. It's been 2 years since I did an episode specifically on attachment, and attachment sits at the foundation for understanding trauma, story, and healing, which is what this podcast is all about. By way of a brief introduction, let me remind you why attachment is such a big deal. First, attachment determines your baseline abilities for affect regulation. That's number one, huge. Number two, attachment is also a measure of developmental trauma. If you are insecurely attached, it is highly likely that you experienced developmental trauma growing up. Third, number three, as a result of 1 and 2, attachment profoundly influences how you relate to the people closest to you. Which brings me to the subject of today's podcast. Attachment profoundly influences how you relate with God. So after talking about attachment in general, what I'm going to do is specifically address how your attachment style plays out in your relationship with God. If attachment is somewhat new to you, I highly recommend going back and listening to podcast episode 5, titled Attachment, What It Is and Why It Matters. And also check out episode 7, titled How Your Attachment Style Affects the Way You Relate to Other People. Okay, if you want a visceral understanding of attachment, go over to YouTube and search for the still face experiment. The still face experiment. The video is only 3 minutes long, and it shows what happens to a 1-year-old when her mother stops interacting with her. In other words, the video shows you what happens when the mother moves from an expressive face to a still face, hence the name still face experiment. Here's a summary of the still face experiment. As the video begins, the mother is very engaged with her baby. Although the mother is using small words like, hi, I see you, yes, etc., the baby cannot understand the mother's words because the baby does not have a developed left hemisphere and therefore does not yet have the capacity to understand language. In other words, the engagement between mother and baby is almost entirely nonverbal communication. And so it is a right brain to right brain communication from the mother to the child and from the child back to the mother. It's all nonverbal. But what's being communicated between mother and baby is, I see you. I love you. I care about you. You matter to me. Through a flurry of nonverbal expressive signals, mother and baby are communicating back and forth. It's this sense of, I see you. Oh, you're looking over there. Okay, I'll look over in that direction also, just like you. Why? Because you matter to me. So I'm responding to you, and we're in sync. That's the sense of the interaction. And the baby is calm, present, engaged, happy. Now, why? Why is the baby calm and happy? It's because the baby knows that mom is responding to it. This is so important to understand. It's about responsiveness. In fact, if you recorded a video of mom's face as she is interacting with the baby, and then you showed that video to the baby's not going to be calm and happy, even though mom's face is incredibly expressive. The baby is not going to be calm and happy. Why? Because what matters is the synchrony between the mother and the child. If it's out of sync, then even if mom is smiling and upbeat, the child is not going to feel felt, seen, or responded to, and therefore the baby is not going to be calm or happy or relaxed. Now, what happens in the still face experiment is that after about a minute of responsive, synchronous, back and forth interaction, after a short period of that, the mother puts a blank expression on her face. Her face goes blank. And you see the child begin to dysregulate. The child is desperate to get a response from mom's blank face. Desperate to get a response from mom. And so the child begins to reach out and cry and grasp. This is the beginning of what we call protest in attachment language. It's all over the Psalms. It's in the book of Job. It's all over the book of Lamentations. It's the writer saying to God, you were here a moment ago. Now you seem to be absent. Why won't you respond to me? Hear my prayer. Listen to my sigh. That kind of protest language. These are psalmic expressions of attachment cry, attachment protest. Now, as the still face experiment continues, and the mother's expression is still blank, you see the child begin to lose a sense of itself. It begins to flail. And that flailing is a deeply dysregulated body that is panicky, that is terrified, and that is moving toward despair. So if the experiment had continued for more than a couple of minutes, you would have seen the child move to a posture of utter defeat and despair. Hopelessness. There would not be panic. There would not be flailing. There would be a hopeless despair. It's the hopelessness of, I cannot get this person who is so important to me to respond to me. Now, the researchers stopped the experiment before it got to this point to protect the child. Instead, the researchers let mom comfort her child, and you can see the child quickly return to a regulated, joyful state as soon as mom is back being responsive to the child. But many of us have felt something of the still face experiment with God. God is in the role of the mother and we are the child. When we talk about attachment to God, we're talking about our bodies either feeling calm and safe and regulated in God's presence or feeling dysregulated in God's presence. And all of that is a function of, do I feel like God is responding to me? Do I feel like God sees me? Do I feel like God cares about me? What do I have to do to get God's attention? Okay, let's do a quick review of attachment. What is it? Why is it so important? Attachment is the degree to which I feel relationally connected to my primary caregiver. That connectedness, that attachment, then affects how I interact with the wider world as an adult, especially with intimate partners. The degree to which I have a felt sense in my body, because attachment is inherently an embodied experience, a felt sense in my body that I am safe, that I am going to be responded to when I have needs, and that I matter to this important other person in my life. Specifically, my experience with attachment as an infant impacts how I respond when my connection to the important other person in my life feels threatened, or when that connection ruptures, when there's conflict. The foundation of what's called secure attachment is attunement. Attunement refers to paying attention to the nonverbal communication of the other person. So, in the still face experiment, attunement is the mother's attention to the facial expression, tone of voice, and body posture of the child. When I'm talking to my wife, if I am attuned to her, that means I am reading her facial expression. I am reading her tone of voice, her body posture, and it is informing my understanding of what's happening on her insides, what she's feeling, how she's doing. Attunement is my attention to your nonverbal communication. Now, when you are on the receiving end of attunement, you feel very safe, very loved, and you feel what Dan Siegel calls feeling felt. I love that phrase. You feel felt. It's this sense that you know what I'm feeling on the inside. And that's okay with you, what I'm feeling. And you care about it. And you'll engage with me there. When we're not attuned to, there's a disconnection relationally. and we can feel relationally cut off. In other words, we can feel like we're alone because there's rupture in the relationship. Now, think about this. If you are created in the image of a triune God, a God who is deeply relational at God's very core, what do you think is going to happen inside your body when relationship is ruptured? You are going to experience a sense of separation and being cut off. It is not a stretch, theologically or neurobiologically, to say that this is a form of hell. To be separated and cut off from deep relational connection, from being known and welcomed and embraced, that is a form of hell. And when we are not attuned to, we feel separate and alienated and cut off. We feel other. So attunement establishes the possibility of secure attachment. Now, what about insecure attachment? Insecure attachment can go in primarily one of two directions. The first is called ambivalent attachment. Ambivalent attachment is the first type of insecure attachment. What is it? Well, when your primary caregiver is inconsistent and intrusive in their response to you, you will develop what's called ambivalent attachment. And here's what I mean by inconsistent and intrusive. I cry out from my crib because I am hungry, wet diaper, whatever it is. And sometimes mom will come in, respond to me, meet my needs, soothe me, until my affect is regulated again, until I'm happy again. But other times, mom will come into my room, look at me, and walk right out of the door again because she's preoccupied with something else. Or mom won't even come into the room because mom is dealing with her own anxiety, her own preoccupations. And so I am left with a sense of never knowing if mom is going to respond to me when I need her. For a baby, this is terror. The terror of not knowing if I'm going to be responded to with care, kindness, love, or not. There is a randomness to mom's responsiveness and care for me. Sometimes it's there, sometimes it's not. And so I don't develop a trust in my nervous system, a trust that I'm going to be responded to and tended to by my primary caregiver. Okay, that's inconsistency. The second attribute of the relationship between the baby and her primary caregiver that results in ambivalent attachment is intrusiveness. Intrusiveness. This refers to a relationship in which mom or dad asks you to meet their needs rather than them meeting your needs. Ambivalent attachment is often the result of marital discord between mom and dad. When mom and dad don't have a strong relationship, when they are not engaged in a mutually repentant relationship where they're committed to honesty and to talking things through, that divide between mom and dad will result in one or both of them looking to the children to meet their needs, or to one of the children to meet their needs. Because we will, as adults, get our attachment needs met in some way. And if they're not being met through our spouse, we very often look to our children or to one of them. This results in what's called triangulation. If dad is emotionally checked out and mom suddenly has this 1-year-old son who is all eyes on mom, mom may train that child to be responsive to mom's needs. And as the child grows up, the child begins to be used as a surrogate spouse to mom. That's ambivalent attachment. It is caused by your primary caregiver's inconsistency and intrusiveness. Now, when an ambivalently attached child becomes an adult, they are prone to anxiety and panic, especially when there is relational conflict with someone important to them. You don't have a sense that relational conflict will resolve. You don't have a felt sense in your nervous system that there will be repair. And so you often get dysregulated affect into what's called hyperarousal. And episode 20 of the podcast talks about affect regulation, talks about hyper and hypoarousal. Ambivalent attachment is associated with hyperarousal, which is panic, terror, fear. You get jittery inside, you get amped up inside when there's conflict, especially with loved ones. Okay, that's ambivalent attachment. Now, the other primary type of insecure attachment is called avoidant attachment. Avoidant attachment is when your caregiver was dismissive and or rejecting of you. In other words, they just didn't respond to your cries for help. They just didn't. And so you, as a 9-month-old, a 3-year-old, a 12-year-old, have the felt experience of, I'm completely alone in this world. Think orphan in terms of Old Testament language. I am alone in this world, and if my needs are going to be met, I have to meet them on my own. And so your fundamental experience of life is that of an orphan, because no one was ever there for you. In other words, your emotional needs didn't matter to your primary caregivers. Somebody who grows up into adulthood with avoidant attachment is often going to be very disconnected from their emotions because their needs and wants and emotions never mattered. And so they couldn't bear to feel them. They couldn't bear to feel their need for relational connection and then be dismissed or rejected yet again. So they slowly but surely disconnect from their own emotions and their own desires to a certain degree, particularly their desires for relationship. Moreover, avoidantly attached adults are often more comfortable, understandably, with relational distance, even in their most important relationships. Emotional distance has been their typical experience and is often more comfortable and less dysregulating than emotional engagement with a romantic partner, especially during conflict. Okay, that's avoidant attachment. I know it was a short summary, but if you want more, you can go back and listen to episode 7. The focus of today is this question. How does your attachment style play out in your relationship with God? Let's start with us ambivalently attached folks. By the way, I am indebted to Bonnie Poonzal, Z-A-H-L, who has written a very helpful article on this whole subject titled Attachment Theory and Your Relationship with God. Bonnie Poonzal. If you are ambivalently attached, your relationship with God is likely going to be marked by the following. You will feel a sense of anxiety and at times fear. You will likely have a history of preoccupation with whether or not God actually loves you. You are more likely to be frustrated or angry if you can't sense God working in your day-to-day life. And the whole idea of maintaining a healthy relationship with God will be very important to you. You'll worry about it, and you will also work at it. How is my relationship with God right now? Is it strong and close, or is it distant? And why? This will be anxiety-producing for you. Your relationship with God will be marked by a sense of, God, do you see me? And if you do, why won't you respond to me? Because as someone who is ambivalently attached, your brain has been shaped to anticipate relational disappointment. You expect to be dropped. You expect inconsistency. You expect God to not be there for you. All of the above are really about anxiety over the possibility of abandonment. Your times of prayer are often going to be more emotional and more fragile than if you were securely attached. It's this sense of highs with God, big highs, where you feel really seen and you feel really connected to God, and then periods of just absence, where you do not feel that God is present at all. And that inconsistency, that up and down, evokes fear inside, anxiety, sometimes panic. It's this sense of, I can't count on God. I don't know what my time with God will hold today because God seems to be unpredictable to me. My experience with God is marked by unpredictability, not consistency. Now, in contrast to that, an avoidantly attached Christian will be inclined to have a cerebral relationship with God, and it will be difficult for them to experience warmth and emotional closeness in their relationship with God. They might be interested in theology, but it is unlikely that they will have a rich, psalmic-like prayer life where they bring their emotions to God and have an engagement with God that is intimate. Because intimacy is a function of emotional connection, and an avoidantly attached adult is not very connected to their emotions because it's too painful to be so. And so their relationship with God is going to be more heady, more cerebral. There won't often be an emotional richness with God. And therefore, they will always feel like something's just not quite right. Unlike ambivalently attached people, when those of you who are avoidantly attached are in distress, you won't feel a deep need to establish closeness to God. You prefer not to depend too much on God. You expect God to be absent to some degree at any time. And to protect against the discomfort of God's sudden absence, you tend to live life, quote unquote, knowing that you are on your own emotionally. The best you can do in that setting is to bring your mind to God and to make sense theologically of God's absence and your orphanhood. In other words, an avoidantly attached person is going to have a hard time bringing their heart to God. They can bring their mind. Reading scripture may come easily to them. Reading books about Christianity, Christian life, theology, all of that, because it's very cerebral. But they're going to have a hard time bringing their desires to God, their vulnerability, their longings. In other words, an avoidantly attached person has a hard time connecting emotionally with God. So, if you ask an avoidantly attached man, for example, what are you longing for from God right now? They may have a hard time answering that question. They may even take offense at the question, and they might push back, saying, that's not an appropriate question. God is not a vending machine. God's not here to meet my desires. Now, what's going on here? What's happening? Why the defensiveness? The question about what they are desiring from God activated the attachment circuitry in their brain. It's an attachment kind of question. Whenever you ask someone about relational longings or desires, you are activating the attachment circuitry in their brain. And remember them at 9 months old. Dismissed or rejected every time they have a desire or need, particularly a relational one. So they have distanced themselves from their relational longings. As a result, avoidantly attached people have a difficult time emotionally connecting with God, particularly over their deep desires. They are likely to be somewhat puzzled by the pouring out of emotion to God in the Psalms, and may wonder why you are calling them to do something like that. You're inviting them to go to very painful places in their heart by the nature of your question that used the word longing. Okay, that's avoidantly attached people. Now, what about securely attached people? Securely attached people are able to remain continually connected with God through the highs and lows of life. Their relationship with God can be warm and emotionally close, but they don't panic when God feels distant and far away. Secure attachment to God means low avoidance of God, low avoidance of emotions, low avoidance of desires, and low anxiety with God. We relate to God the way we learn to relate to our primary caretakers. That is always true unless we've done significant work and experienced significant healing. So, if you are ambivalently attached, your relationships are going to be marked by certain characteristics, and your relationship with your Heavenly Father will likewise share these characteristics. If you are avoidantly attached, your relationship with other people, it's going to be marked by certain characteristics, and your relationship with God is going to be marked by the same characteristics. This need not discourage anyone. It allows you to put language to what Dan Allender calls your style of relating. Each of us has a style of relating, and that's why, for those folks who are married, you still have the same fights with your spouse that you were having 10 years ago. Why are you fighting about the same stuff 10 years later? It's not because you're dumb. It's because there are things at play in the depth of your heart that are trying to get worked out, and those things are all related to attachment. One last comment on the subject of attachment and your relationship with God. Let me pose a question to you, a sort of thought experiment, an imagination experiment. In your imagination, when you imagine God looking at you, what is God's face toward you? If you were to imagine God walking up to you right now, what would God's facial expression be? What do you imagine is God's face toward you? When many people do this mental exercise, they say, I have this image of God that is disappointed in me and or frustrated with me. These responses are far more about your insecure attachment than about anything else. Cognitively, you know that God delights in you and embraces you and includes you and welcomes you. Theologically, you believe all that stuff. So what's going on? Well, one byproduct of insecure attachment is self-contempt. The fruit of insecure attachment is great difficulty having a posture of kindness toward your own heart, toward your own self. If you want to know your posture towards yourself, spend 30 seconds looking at your face in the mirror and just notice what comes up inside of you. This can be a very intense practice. Just look at your own face in the mirror and see what you begin to feel inside your body. For many people with insecure attachment, people with trauma, there will be feelings of contempt rather than kindness and welcome. But Jesus does not have contempt for your face, for your heart, for your behavior, for your frailty, for your weakness. He does not. God has no interest in condemning anything about you. So why do you have contempt for yourself? It's a fair question, and it's a question that needs to be reflected on anytime we're talking about attachment to God, because our own self-contempt often gets in the way of attaching to God more than anything else. So, closing question. As you think about your relationship with God, have you considered how your attachment style might be affecting how you experience God, how you relate with God on a day-to-day basis? There are two types of knowledge about God: doctrinal knowledge and experiential knowledge. Your experiential knowledge of God, in other words, your sense of what God is like as a father, this knowledge is deeply influenced by your attachment to your parents. Haven't you noticed that there's a disconnect between your doctrinal knowledge of God, in other words, what you cognitively believe God is like, and your experiential knowledge of God, what you feel God is like? There's always a disconnect there. Why? Because attachment dynamics run down into the deepest parts of us. Will you allow this reality to prompt you to have compassion for yourself, for where you are? Compassion for why it's so hard for you to believe that God loves you when you fail. Or compassion for why it's so hard for you to trust God when you are anxious about some scary circumstance in your life. Thank you for listening to this episode of the Place We Find Ourselves podcast. Remember that if you want to get episodes as soon as they are released, you need to download the Place We Find Ourselves app from the App Store, and then you need to pay $3 per month or $30 per year to subscribe. You can do all of those things from my website. Just click on the podcast heading and follow the prompts. Have a great couple of weeks, everyone.